It was in the second week of March, in the year 1893, that an unusually raw fog hung over London so thick and impenetrable that even the stoic gas lamps, lining Baker Street like solemn sentinels, seemed to cower behind veils of yellowed mist. The day had passed without incident, and I had resigned myself to the warmth of the fire and the drowsy flicker of embers when the sound of sharp, deliberate footsteps ascending the stairs roused me from my reverie. Sherlock Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his eyes half closed in a posture that could have been mistaken for repose by any man who did not know him. I knew better. The creases at the corners of his mouth, the slight tension about his temple, these were the signs of a mind as taut as a drawn bowstring, waiting only for the right note to set it loose. "You will observe, Watson," said Holmes, without so much as lifting an eyelid, "that our visitor is a woman, recently arrived from the West End, in distress, and carrying a small bouquet of violets in her left hand." "I confess," I started. "Holmes, really, how could you possibly—" But he raised a languid finger toward the closed door. As if on cue, there came a gentle but urgent rap upon it. Mrs. Hudson, our ever-punctual landlady, had not preceded the visitor with her usual knock. Evidently, the guest had found her way unaided. "Enter," Holmes called. The door opened, and in stepped a young woman, perhaps no more than 25, her bearing both elegant and tremulous. She wore a plum-colored traveling cloak fastened with a jet brooch, and upon it that had seen the worst of the mist. Her gloves were still damp, and in her left hand, just as Holmes had predicted, was a small clutch of violets, somewhat wilted by the weather. "Miss Violet Marchmont," Holmes announced. The young woman blinked in astonishment. "Why, yes, but how could you?" "My dear madam," Holmes said, motioning her gently toward the chair opposite him, "it is simplicity itself. You are wearing a mourning ring, but no veil, suggesting a recent loss not immediate enough to require full mourning, perhaps the distant relative. The rain-dabbed hem of your dress bears a reddish residue peculiar to the paving stones near Cavendish Square. The scent of orris root in your perfume, combined with your accent, places you in the West End, most likely near Harley Street. And lastly," he gestured with a slight nod, "the violets." Miss Marchmont's gloved fingers clutched the flowers reflexively. "They were his," she said softly. Holmes leaned forward, the gleam of interest in his eyes unmistakable. "His?" "My brother, Mr. Edmund Marchmont. He was a poet, or fancied himself one. But something has happened, Mr. Holmes. Something terrible." I took a closer look at the girl. Her features were refined high cheekbones, a narrow chin, and eyes of an unusual greenish-gray hue. But it was not her beauty that held my attention. It was her evident distress, the tremble in her voice, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together after each word, as if she were trying to suppress some secret horror. Holmes rose, fetched a carafe of water from the sideboard, and poured her a glass, which she accepted with murmured thanks. "Pray," he said, "begin at the beginning. Spare no detail, however, trivial it may seem." She took a steadying breath. "My brother Edmund has lived alone for nearly a year in a small flat on Clipstone Street, not far from Regent's Park. He was quiet, thoughtful, and quite solitary. He made his living, such as it was, writing verses for small periodicals and reading at literary salons. I was his only close family. 3 days ago, I received a letter from him full of agitation. He begged me to come at once, to bring no one, and to destroy the letter after reading it. He wrote of some danger." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Danger? Of what sort?" She shook her head. "He didn't say. Only that he had uncovered something dreadful, and that he feared for his life. I went to his flat the very next morning. But he was gone. Gone. Vanished, Mr. Holmes. The door was locked from the inside. The police had to be called to break it open. When they entered, they found the fire had gone out, tea had been laid for two, and one of Edmund's manuscripts lay open upon the desk. But there was no sign of him, no struggle, no blood, nothing. Holmes stood quite still. And the manuscript? She fumbled in her reticule and drew forth a page folded many times over. The police dismissed it as verse. But I know my brother's handwriting. And there is something strange about this piece. Holmes unfolded the page and scanned it. I rose and peered over his shoulder. The lines, written in a delicate italic hand, seemed at first glance to be no more than obscure verse, in shadows penned where ink runs thin. A serpent sleeps beneath the skin. The poet's words shall not be read, lest truth awake and strike him dead. Holmes read the lines twice, then handed them to me without comment. Inspector Lestrade is overseeing the matter, Miss Marchmont continued. He believes Edmund fled to avoid creditors, but Edmund had no debts, not serious ones, and he would never leave without a word. Something has happened to him. I can feel it. There was a silence as Holmes moved to the hearth and stood with one elbow on the mantel. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the low moan of the wind outside, as if London herself were drawing a long breath before exhaling some darker truth. I presume, Holmes said at last, that you still possess the letter your brother sent? She hesitated. I burned it, as he asked. Holmes sighed through his nose. Pity, but no matter. We shall begin at Clipstone Street tomorrow. Watson, you will accompany me. With pleasure, I said. Miss Marchmont rose, seemingly steadier now. One last question, Holmes said, and his voice had taken on that cold, precise tone I had come to associate with his most acute observations. These violets, why bring them? She looked down at the little bouquet, as though seeing it for the first time. They were left on his doorstep. Yesterday morning. To be continued in Chapter 2. The locked room on Clipstone Street, you said. Yes, ChatGPT said. Excellent. Here's Chapter 2 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, continuing in Dr. Watson's immersive voice, with proper atmosphere, deduction, and escalating tension. It was a gray morning the next day when Holmes and I set off for Clipstone Street, the fog of the previous evening having thinned only slightly, lingering like a hangman's veil over the chimneys and rooftops of Marylebone. The clip-clop of the hansom cab's horse seemed unusually subdued, as if the beast itself sensed we were bound for a place where unease had taken root. Holmes was in one of his more silent moods, his long frame hunched slightly as he stared out. The misted window with a distant intensity that told me his mind was already pacing the corridors on Mr. Edmund Marchmont's vanished footsteps. Tell me, Watson, he said at last, without turning, what do you make of the verse, Miss Marchmont? Presented? I rubbed my hands for warmth and considered. Symbolic, perhaps. A poetic expression of guilt or a fear of betrayal. Certainly nothing literal. Poets are often dramatic by nature. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. You are not wrong, but neither are you entirely correct. The key is in the second line. A serpent sleeps beneath the skin. You recall the Roman symbol of the pen as a weapon? A serpent hidden in the pen, yes, like poison in an innocent tool. Precisely. I believe our vanished poet may have stumbled upon something deadly, hidden not in the words themselves, but in the hands of those who wield them. The cab drew to a halt on a narrow terrace of respectable but weathered flats. Clipstone Street bore the look of the quietly decaying middle-class respectability so often found in these districts once prosperous, now clinging to dignity by the starch of their curtains and the polish of their brass knockers. A constable stood outside No. 93, his blue coat glistening with dew. He recognized Holmes at once. Morning, Mr. Holmes. Inspector Lestrade said you might be about. Holmes inclined his head. Is the flat as it was? Aye, sir. Locked from the inside when we arrived. Still is, more or less. Inspector said, to let you in directly. We ascended a narrow staircase with creaking treads to the second floor. The air was close, and I noted a faint trace of mustiness, as though the flat had exhaled once, and then held its breath ever since. Holmes paused outside the door, inspecting the lock with interest. Forced, but not violently, he murmured, as though someone wanted access, but also deniability. The constable unlocked the door, and we stepped inside. The room was modest, but tastefully arranged. A sitting area with a threadbare rug and a pair of armchairs. A writing desk by the window with an empty inkwell and scattered papers. A small hearth, cold now, but bearing the gray ghost of a fire long dead. On the mantel was a bronze bust of Shelley, its nose slightly chipped. There were no signs of struggle. Yet something in the room felt wrong. Holmes stood quite still, taking in the details with eyes that missed nothing. Tea laid for two, I said, nodding to the tray. One cup unwashed, the other barely touched. Holmes moved to the desk. He touched the ink blotter and raised a brow, bone dry. He hadn't written in some time before disappearing. Yet the police found the verse out on this desk. He picked up the scattered sheets and shuffled them gently. Poems some unfinished, some discarded. But none matched the handwriting of the verse Miss Marchmont gave us. I frowned. Are you certain? Absolutely. Her brother's hand is flowing, romantic, almost too affected. The serpent verse was written in a sharper, more angular script. Then someone else wrote it? Someone who wanted it to seem like Marchmont did. Holmes crossed to the hearth and crouched low. He examined the grate with a small magnifying lens, brushing aside a layer of gray ash. I noticed a faint, greenish tinge where the soot clung to the brick's dot. He rose with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Copper arsenite, also known as Shields green. Poison? A pigment, arsenic-based, common in certain inks and dyes, but also used in smaller quantities in some early types of paper. He moved back to the desk and lifted the corner of one of the manuscripts with his gloved hand. This page is unusually brittle. See how the edge crumbles? I nodded. Now look here. He pointed to a blot of ink at the corner. Note: the slight iridescence. Ink tainted with copper arsenite will shine slightly under damp conditions. The fire might have disguised it, but not from me. A dreadful suspicion began to grow in my mind. Are you suggesting that someone poisoned Marchmont through his ink? Not quite, but close. I believe someone introduced the poison into a manuscript, perhaps more than one, under the pretense of editing or gifting paper. A manuscript that Mr. Marchmont may have touched, handled, perhaps even licked his fingers to turn. But wouldn't he fall ill before vanishing? If the dose were small, subtle, cumulative, it could explain Miss Marchmont's mention of his increasing agitation and paranoia. A poisoned mind. It is not the first time arsenic has been used to drive a man to madness before death. There was a knock at the door. A sharp, impatient rapping. Lestrade entered without waiting for a reply, his face set with its usual blend of irritation and professional pride. Holmes, I might have known. Sticking your nose where Scotland Yard is already sniffing. Holmes gave a genial nod. You will be pleased to learn, Lestrade, that I have already identified the ink, the pigment, and the presence of an unknown hand. Lestrade rolled his eyes. I'm sure you have. But as it happens, we've found a new piece of evidence ourselves. Oh? The landlady came forward this morning. Found a torn page crumpled in the stairwell bin. It's got Marchmont's initials on it and a name scrawled across the bottom. Bartholomew Strake? Ring any bells? Holmes's eyes sharpened. Strake? Yes, editor at the London Aesthete, a notorious egoist and literary patron. He was known to Mentor certain. Young poets. Lestrade snorted. Mentor? Sounds more like blackmail, if you ask me. We've got men looking for him now. Holmes turned back to the desk. Find him quickly, Inspector, before he becomes the next man to vanish. To be continued in Chapter 3. The editor in the shadows. Let me know when you'd like to proceed. Till Chapter 3. You said, yes, ChatGPT said, certainly. Here is Chapter 3 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, in Watson's immersive narration, maintaining tone, mystery, and Victorian detail. The name Bartholomew Strake lingered in my mind long after we left the rooms on Clipstone Street. There was something distinctly disagreeable about it, perhaps the harshness of the consonants, or the sinister precision with which Holmes had spoken it. It was a name that evoked ink-stained ledgers, veiled threats in elegant handwriting, and whispered meetings in shadowed cafes d'art. As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes fell into one of his prolonged silences, his eyes half-lidded, but alert beneath his brows, like a hawk pretending to slumber on its perch. I knew better than to interrupt him when he was arranging mental pieces upon his inner chessboard. My own thoughts turned to the strange lines of poetry, the hint of madness in Marchmont's letter, and now this mysterious editor with a penchant for young poets and possibly poisoned verse. Back in our sitting room, Holmes drew the blinds, lit the fire, and settled into his chair with a thin monograph in hand. Strake, he said suddenly, was once a minor poet himself, though time has largely erased the memory. He found more success collecting the works of others and building a small empire of literary salons and obscure journals. The London Aesthete is his flagship, a haven for melancholic verse and decadent criticism. Is he dangerous? I asked. In the sense that all subtle men are dangerous, Holmes replied, steepling his fingers. He understands the currency of influence. A kind word in his review pages can make a young man's name overnight. A whisper of scandal can unmake it just as quickly. Marchmont, I suspect, was both his protégé and his prisoner. A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram on a silver salver. Holmes opened it, read quickly, and stood. Lestrade is faster than expected, he said. They've located Strake. He is at his club, the Sphinx in Bloomsbury. Shall we? 10 minutes later, we were in another cab, winding through the still damp streets. London had shaken off some of its morning fog, though a low, ashen sky still pressed upon the rooftops. The Sphinx Club was one of those peculiar establishments, born of Victorian eccentricity, part literary salon, part gentleman's retreat, and part theater of pretense. Its brass nameplate was discreetly tarnished, and the doorman bore the expression of a man perpetually unimpressed. We were shown to a quiet drawing-room upholstered in deep reds and tobacco-colored leather. There, seated beneath a portrait of Byron, and exhaling an aromatic haze from a slender black cigarette, was Bartholomew Strake. He was not what I expected. Slight of build, immaculately dressed in a black velvet jacket and a dove-gray waistcoat. Strake had the look of a man who curated every gesture. His hair was thick and iron-gray at the temples, his beard pointed like a Van Dyke, and his expression, when he looked up, was as insincere as a flattered reviewer. Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson, he said smoothly. To what do I owe this literary visitation? Holmes did not sit. He moved slowly around the room, taking in the volumes, the empty decanter on the sideboard, the faint chalk lines on the carpet where a Persian rug had recently been moved. You knew Edmund Marchmont, Holmes said, without preamble. Strake blew a ring of smoke into the air. Knew? Still do. Edmund is a rather tormented soul, but a brilliant one. His verses possess a rare fragility like spider silk in the rain. He is missing. Strake blinked, but slowly like an actor about to deliver a soliloquy. Missing? How dramatic! Holmes said nothing. He merely stared, his gray eyes narrowing. Strake shifted in his seat. "I've not seen him for several days. Our last correspondence was brief. He submitted a poem for next month's issue, something vaguely threatening and entirely metaphorical." "Did you edit his work directly?" Holmes asked. "Occasionally. I offer suggestions, rarely accepted. Edmund was very particular." "Did you ever send him manuscript paper?" Strake smiled again. "I've gifted writing paper to many contributors, part of the charm of the trade." "Do you mean to suggest what?" "That I poisoned him with stationery." Holmes turned to the fireplace, where a pile of half-burned proofs smoldered. "You destroyed something," he said. "A failed editorial," Strake replied coolly. "Every writer must discard the worst parts of themselves, or risk publication." "I?" Noted Holmes's hand slide into his coat and withdraw a small glass vial. "Have you ever seen this pigment before?" he asked. Strake took the vial and held it to the light. "Shields green, Victorian poison of choice for wallpapers. Also used in printing ink, though far less common now." Holmes returned the vial to his pocket. "Let me be perfectly clear, Mr. Strake," he said, and the steel had entered his voice. "Your protégé may be dead. Or worse, a verse written by a hand other than his own was left at the scene. There are signs of arsenic contamination in his flat, specifically in the ink and paper. We have reason to believe this was deliberate." Strake set his cigarette down. "I did not poison Edmund Marchmont, but you may have known someone who did." A beat passed between them. Then Strake leaned back and sighed. "There is one possibility," he said quietly. "A man named Avery Vellum. He's no poet, more of a literary parasite. Writes scandalous pastiches. Sells gossip under the guise of criticism. He and Edmund crossed swords recently, something about a forged sonnet and a duel of reputations. I kept out of it. Where can we find this Vellum?" Strake stubbed out the cigarette. "He lives in an attic flat above a printer's workshop in Holborn. Number 6.5 Pennywell Lane. But I warn you, Mr. Holmes Vellum is not merely unpleasant. He is clever and dangerous." Holmes turned and nodded curtly. "So are we." To be continued in Chapter 4. The Man on Pennywell Lane. Shall I continue? With Chapter 4? You said? Yes, ChatGPT said. Certainly. Here is Chapter 4 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, continuing the mystery in Dr. Watson's voice. There is a certain squalor unique to London's literary underbelly, an air of grandeur gone to seed, of dreams pursued with ink-stained desperation, amid the thin carpets and threadbare drapes of a city that never quite pays its poets. Pennywell Lane, in the southern quarter of Holborn, was just such a place. The buildings leaned like gossiping spinsters, and the air smelled faintly of boiled ink, damp coal, and lost ambition. We found number 6.5 at the very end of the lane. A narrow brick tenement with crooked windows, and a faded sign above the door reading Granger and Sons, printers and bookbinders since 1847. The entrance to the attic lodgings, however, was tucked around the side, a grimy door with peeling green paint and a tarnished brass number. Barely affixed. Holmes did not knock. He tested the doorknob, found it unlatched, and ascended the steep stairway 2 steps at a time, silent as a shadow. I followed more cautiously. The stairs creaked with every step, and the walls were close enough that my coat brushed against the cracked plaster dock at the top. We found a landing and a single door dash ajar. Holmes raised a hand, bidding silence, and then pushed the door inward with the tip of his cane. The room beyond was small, but surprisingly neat. A cot, a cluttered writing table, 2 bookcases buckling under the weight of old periodicals, and a narrow fireplace in which only the ashes remained. In contrast to the gloom outside, the space was bright, lit by a large, slanted skylight. It cast an uncanny wash of pale light across the room, making the dust in the air shimmer like frost. but of Avery vellum. There was no sign. Holmes moved quickly, but without haste, his eyes taking in every detail. I saw his gaze flick to a half-filled teacup, still warm, an overturned chair, a sheet of foolscap with jagged ink strokes. On the desk lay an envelope addressed, curiously, to Bartholomew Strake-esque. Holmes snatched it up, then hesitated. "Watson, your handkerchief." I handed it to him, and he used it to open the letter delicately, careful not to smudge any fingerprint or stain. The letter within was a single page, written in a hand that looked more violent than elegant. The ink was dark, the letters angular and quick, as if scrawled in agitation. "Strake, you may think you hold the reins, but I know the game." Marchmont was a pawn, nothing more. He found the manuscript, yes, but he didn't understand what he was holding. I did, and I'm not about to let your kind poison the pen again. This time the ink fights back. -V. Holmes read it thrice, then handed it to me without comment. "Well," I said, "that seems to confirm Strake's role in this business. At the very least, he and vellum were entangled in something beyond mere literary rivalry." Holmes crouched by the fireplace. "Indeed. And look, here remains of a burnt document, not fully destroyed." He extracted a curled scrap with his forceps. On it, just legible in the char, were the words, "Truth shall poison more than—" Holmes nodded grimly. "It's a piece of the same poem Miss Marchmont brought us." Suddenly, a scuffling footstep from the floor below. Holmes was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room and peering out the landing's window. I joined him, just in time to see a man in a dark coat and bowler hat disappearing down the alley behind the building. He moved with the twitchy haste of someone who feared pursuit, yet had not quite been caught. "Quickly, Watson," Holmes snapped, and we raced down the stairs. We reached the alley seconds later, but the man was gone. Only a fluttering piece of paper remained on the damp cobbles. Holmes stooped, retrieved it, and frowned. It was a theater handbill. "The Taming of the Shrew, one night only, Lyceum Theater." He turned it over. On the reverse, in smeared pencil, someone had written, "Curari? Ask Redmore." Holmes's eyes lit with something like excitement. Curari, a rare poison paralytic, swift and difficult to trace in small doses. "You think it was used on Marchmont?" "It's a possibility I had not fully considered until now. Arsenic would act slowly, with symptoms, but curari? A drop might render a man catatonic, mute, even simulate death. That could explain a disappearance without a struggle. And Redmore? Unknown. But I intend to find out." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes summoned the aid of his irregulars, the street urchins who, under the name of the Baker Street Division, provided the keenest intelligence network in London. Within an hour, a sooty-faced lad named Wiggins returned with news. "Redmore, sir?" "That'd be Jasper Redmore, chemist, down Lambeth Way. Odd fellow. Used to give lectures to them medical students, but now he mostly works private." Holmes straightened. "Address?" "Round the back of Chapel Market. Sign says J. Redmore, apothecary and consulting chemist. Bit of a rum cove, he is." Holmes turned to me, a familiar glint dancing in his eyes. "Come, Watson. We are about to enter the company of a man who traffics in poisons, secrets, and perhaps murder." "But we've still no idea what happened to Marchmont," I protested, "nor why someone would poison him through his writing." Holmes smiled thinly. "That, my dear fellow, is what we are about to find out. To be continued in Chapter V. The Chemist of Chapel Market. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 5? You said, yes, ChatGPT said. Certainly. Here is Chapter 5 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, continuing the investigation in Dr. Watson's faithful narration. If ever there were a corner of London that seemed preserved in a tincture of gloom, It was Chapel Market that afternoon. The narrow street, which bustled with rag sellers, greengrocers, and barrow boys in the daylight hours, now stood half empty, beneath a sky stained with impending rain. The air was thick with the odor of damp cloth and stale fish, and a scattering of market refuse stirred about our boots as Holmes and I made our way along the uneven cobblestones. We found the establishment of J. Redmore tucked behind a shuttered tobacconist's shop, its doorway recessed and nearly swallowed by soot-darkened brick. The lettering on the sign was hand-painted in faded gold leaf, and the display window was cluttered with an eclectic collection of glassware, apothecary jars, and yellowed anatomical diagrams. The bell above the door jangled with a brittle clang. As we entered, the interior was dim, the smell immediately striking, a heady mixture of alcohol, lavender oil, and something acrid and metallic that caught in the back of the throat. Shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of vials, powders, tinctures, and preserved specimens floating in cloudy spirits. Behind the tall counter stood a man of extraordinary appearance. He was tall and lean, with silver-white hair cropped close to the skull, and a pair of pince-nez perched high upon a blade-thin nose. His coat was a deep maroon velvet, stained at the cuffs, and his fingers were long and unusually pale, as though they spent more time in moonlight than sun. "Gentlemen," he said in a voice dry as crumpled paper, "are you in need of cure or curse?" Holmes stepped forward. "We are looking for Jasper Redmore. I am he. We require a consultation of the more sensitive kind. May we speak privately?" Redmore's colorless eyes studied Holmes carefully. Then he nodded and gestured us behind a faded curtain at the rear of the shop. We passed into a cramped back room, part laboratory, part study, where the air grew heavier with chemical fumes and the faint, telltale tang of formaldehyde. Holmes declined the single chair and remained standing. "You supplied curare to a man named Vellum," Holmes said without preamble. There was no visible reaction, but Redmore's head tilted slightly to one side. "I do not sell poisons, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Only knowledge. If Mr. Vellum wished to discuss the paralytic properties of South American alkaloids, that is not a crime." "Nor is it a coincidence," Holmes replied. "We are investigating the disappearance, possibly the murder of a young poet named Edmund Marchmont. We believe curare was used, and your name was found scrawled on a note dropped by someone fleeing Vellum's flat." Redmore folded his long hands. "Then I am flattered that someone considers my expertise worth noting." I was struck by the man's strange composure, as if he lived at some remove from the world of ordinary men. Holmes's gaze remained fixed. "Tell me, what quantity of curare would be sufficient to paralyze a man without killing him?" "That would depend entirely on the purity of the solution, the means of administration, and the subject's constitution. A fraction of a milligram, if introduced into the bloodstream. Perhaps absorbed through a cut, though it's imprecise. More elegant would be dissolution in a liquid. Tea, perhaps. Or," his mouth twitched in a half-smile, "ink. Watson." And I exchanged glances. Holmes said, "You were aware of the pigment Shields green?" "Of course, arsenical, once common in wallpapers, highly toxic." "And you would never combine it with curare?" Redmore gave a soft, breathy laugh. "I would do nothing of the sort, Mr. Holmes, but I could tell you what someone else might achieve by doing so. A double-action toxin, arsenic to agitate the nerves and mind over time. Curare distill them entirely when the moment arrives." I felt a chill run down my spine. Holmes nodded once, as if some inner suspicion had just been confirmed. "Thank you, Mr. Redmore. One last question. Was Vellum working alone?" Redmore's face tightened, just briefly. "You assume too much, Mr. Holmes. Writers are seldom alone. They have critics, editors, publishers, patrons, parasites. He stood, the signal clear. Our audience was over. Back in the street, the first drops of rain began to fall. "Well," I said, as we turned up our coat collars, "this grows more monstrous by the hour." A man rendered mad by his own pen, perhaps even made to disappear with the aid of poisons known only to chemists and killers. Holmes said nothing for a while. Then Redmore knew more than he said. He is not the architect of this plot, but I suspect he helped furnish the tools. Willingly? Perhaps. But someone else arranged the composition. We turned into a narrow side street. Strake? I asked, possibly, or someone with greater ambition. As we passed under a street lamp, Holmes withdrew the letter from vellum, the one addressed to Strake. Look again at the last line. This time, the ink fights back. He looked up at me, his face unreadable. I believe Marchmont uncovered something he was never meant to see. A manuscript, a document, a true poisoned pen, not in metaphor, but in physical danger. You believe someone has been killing through literature? Not killing, Holmes said softly. Eliminating, silencing, discrediting, perhaps all. 3. And vellum's reference to the forged sonnet that may not have been poetic license. I stopped. You mean he found a forgery? And someone was willing to kill to keep it hidden? Holmes smiled thin and hard. My dear Watson, if the pen is mightier than the sword, then perhaps it has become a murder weapon in its own right. 2. Be continued in Chapter 6. A forged sonnet. Would you like to continue with Chapter 6? You said call on YesChatGPT said certainly. Here is Chapter 6 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, continuing the mystery in Dr. Watson's voice with all the atmosphere and intrigue of a true Holmes tale. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes was uncharacteristically restless. He paced before the hearth like a lion caged by questions, the smoke of his pipe curling about his sharp features, like steam rising from a locomotive's engine. I had seen him thus before, when he stood on the cusp of some revelation not yet formed, when the facts aligned, but the motive lay hidden like a serpent beneath the reeds. Our sitting room, so often quiet in our bachelor tranquility, now seemed charged with anticipation. The fire crackled, the gas lamps hissed softly, and somewhere outside, a newsboy called out the latest headlines, none of which, I wagered, hinted at the dark literary conspiracy we were beginning to uncover. Holmes stopped abruptly by the window. Watson, he said, you recall Vellum's quarrel with Marchmont over a forged sonnet? Of course. Bartholomew Strake alluded to it. Holmes nodded. Precisely. But I've now reason to believe that the forgery in question was not merely a personal slight. It was a matter of authenticity and provenance, and not involving Marchmont alone. He crossed to the shelf beside the desk and pulled out a slim folio. Miss Violet Marchmont mentioned her brother had submitted poems to multiple journals. I've reviewed copies of the London Aesthete over the past 6 months. Among the recent publications is a poem entitled Sonnet for the Dead Muse, attributed to Marchmont, and printed alongside a glowing editorial note from Strake. He handed me the clipping. The sonnet read, Upon the grave of dreams I lay my lyre. With strings unstruck and silence growing deep, the ashes of ambition lost to fire, while truth and treason twine themselves in sleep. The rest followed in similar lofty tones, but there was something oddly detached about it. Artful, yes, but sterile. A poet writing in borrowed clothes. Do you notice anything peculiar, Watson? I reread the sonnet. It lacks heart. It is technically sound, but curiously cold. You suspect Marchmont did not write it? Holmes gave a short nod. It is a forgery, Watson, and a clever one. Not in form, but in purpose. He opened a drawer and withdrew the original lines we had found at Marchmont's flat, the ones written. In a different hand, a serpent sleeps beneath the skin. Compare the tone. This is Marchmont's real voice, dark, immediate, paranoid. The sonnet, in contrast, is a polished mask. What if someone forged it, not to flatter him, but to discredit? Or implicate him? You mean, to frame him? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Exactly. Just then, there came a firm knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared moments later, carrying a card on a tray. Holmes read it and arched a brow. Miss Marchmont. Well timed. He rose and stepped into the hallway. Moments later, Violet Marchmont entered, her expression composed, but tight with worry. She was dressed in mourning gray, her bonnet in hand and a folded paper clutched between her gloved fingers. I received a letter this morning, she said without greeting, addressed in Edmund's hand or close to it. But the tone, it was not him, Mr. Holmes, and it was unsigned. She handed it to Holmes. He read it quickly, then again more slowly. It said, "Do not pursue the matter. I am safe. I have gone away. For good reasons. Forget the poem. Forget Strake. Forget what I found. Burn this letter." Holmes held the note to the light, then examined the signature, line blank, but slightly indented, as though something had once been written and then erased. Was written on the same type of paper as the forged sonnet, he said. Violet's eyes widened. So it is not from Edmund? I very much doubt it. Or if it is, he was under coercion when he wrote it. She drew a breath. There's more. Last night, someone came to the flat. A man in dark clothes. He didn't knock. He simply stood across the street, watching. When I stepped out to confront him, he vanished into the alley. Holmes leaned forward. Did you see his face? No, only the glint of his glasses. Round spectacles, that's all. Holmes turned to me. Watson, we must pay a second visit to the offices of the London aesthete. Strake has more to answer. For then he admitted, but it's well past dusk. All the better. The truth hides in shadow, but so do those who seek to bury it. Miss Marchmont looked between us, then rose. I won't go home tonight. I've taken a room at the Mitre in Bloomsbury, just in case. I no longer feel safe at Clipstone Street. Wise, Holmes said. Then, Miss Marchmont, should anyone else contact you claiming to speak for your brother, do not meet them. Come to me immediately. She nodded gravely and left. Holmes was already in motion. He strapped on his boots, threw on his coat, and loaded his revolver, uncharacteristic, but telling. Do you anticipate trouble? I asked. I expect it. Strake is at the center of this, Watson. But he is not alone. And tonight, we shall learn who else carries ink beneath their fingernails and blood upon their conscience. To be continued in Chapter 7. The ink-stained ledger. Shall I continue with Chapter 7? You said, Colon, yes, ChatGPT said. Certainly. Here is Chapter 7 of Sherlock. Holmes and the Poisoned Pen. Continuing the investigation in Dr. Watson's voice, building tension and deepening the mystery. The fog had returned by the time we reached Bloomsbury, a thicker, meaner fog than before, creeping low along the gutters and hanging in the branches of the leafless plane trees like funeral gauze. The yellow lamps cast distorted halos in the L. Murk, and the gaslight from shopfronts flickered with every passing gust, as though the city itself were shuddering. Holmes and I approached the offices of the London aesthete, a tall, narrow building, wedged between a milliner's and an antiquarian. Bookshop, all now shuttered for the night. It bore an elegance common to Edwardian conversions, black iron railings, frosted windows etched with ivy patterns, and a brass plate engraved simply, The London Aesthete B. Strake. Editor. To the average passer-by, it would have seemed lifeless at that hour. But Holmes, crouched by the front door, placed a finger to the iron handle and frowned. Warm, he said softly. Used recently. But no bell pull. Odd for a publication of such stature. He gestured upward. Notice the faint glow behind. The curtains of the third floor. Strake is in. We circled to the alleyway behind the building. The fog was thicker here, and the air colder. At the rear was a tradesman's entrance, locked, but yielding to Holmes's skill with a slender blade, and a strip of tensioned wire. In moments we were inside. We moved up a rear stairway, narrow, dark, and dust-ridden, past rooms filled with uncut periodicals, reams of foolscap, and forgotten issues. Each floor bore a smell peculiar to publishing: ink, must, and the ghost. Of old tobacco. At the top landing, Holmes halted. A murmur of voices drifted through the door to the editor's office. The tone was low, tense. Holmes tilted his head. I could just make out two distinct voices, one calm and deliberate, the other strained and unmistakably Strake's. You don't understand. If that sonnet is traced, I understand perfectly, Strake, came the reply, smooth as poured mercury. You assured me the boy was discredited, that he would vanish, not return. Holmes turned the handle and pushed open the door. Bartholomew Strake stood behind a large desk strewn with manuscripts. He paled as we entered. Seated across from him, bathed in the golden glow of a banker's lamp, was a man I had never seen, but who had the aura of someone who owned the very room he occupied. He was tall and grave, dressed in a dark suit of perfect tailoring. His hair was slicked with pomade, and he wore wire spectacles over eyes that gleamed coldly, like glass over ice. He did not rise, but merely looked at Holmes with a faint, sardonic smile. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, he said, your reputation is as persistent as the fog. Holmes regarded him coolly. And you are? Sebastian Grieve, the man said. Solicitor, literary agent, collector of curiosities. In this matter, let us say I am a man who prefers his name remain. Marginal, Strake sputtered. I didn't summon them, Grieve, I swear. Holmes ignored the flailing editor and stepped forward. The forged sonnet was your doing? Grieve smiled faintly. It was authorized. Authorship, Mr. Holmes, is not always what it appears. The public prefers poetry with a tragic backstory. Marchmont was fading. A touch of mystery, an untimely disappearance. Why, it nearly doubled our subscriptions. You mean to say, I said, aghast, you published a poem not written by Marchmont, attributed it to him falsely, and then let him vanish without alerting the authorities? He vanished of his own volition, or so I was led to believe, Grieve replied. The manuscript passed through many hands. Strake merely approved what he believed was genuine. That's a lie. Strake cried. I told you the lines were too clean, too unlike his voice. But you said, I said, Grieve cut in, that the illusion was more important than the author. Which, Mr. Holmes, you must admit, is a principle well understood in the circles of deception. Holmes's eyes were glinting, now sharp and cold. You forged the sonnet, but you also silenced Vellum, who suspected the truth. Mr. Vellum was unstable, Grieve said. He made enemies. He collected blackmail material instead of verses. I never touched him. But you knew what Marchmont had found, Holmes pressed. A manuscript, real or imagined, that frightened him into hiding. One that threatened your operation. Grieve stood now, slowly, his movements deliberate. You're clever, Mr. Holmes, but this is not a matter for courtrooms. It's literature. The boy was not killed, only retired. Words are currency, and sometimes silence is the price of circulation. Holmes stepped closer. Where is Marchmont? Grieve regarded him with something like pity. Safe, or was? I no longer control that. Before Holmes could respond, there came a commotion from the floor below. Footsteps, many of them boots on wood, rising fast. The door burst open behind. U.S. and Lestrade appeared, revolver drawn, 2 constables behind him. Holmes, we found your note. Vellum's body turned up in the river. But there's something else you'll want to see this. Holmes turned. Now? Lestrade nodded grimly. Marchmont's journal. It surfaced. He left it with a printer in Soho for safekeeping. It's rather damning. Holmes turned to Grieve, but the man merely smiled. I told you, Mr. Holmes. Words can kill, but sometimes they come back to haunt us. To be continued in Chapter 8. The Poet's Journal. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8? You said colon. Yes, ChatGPT said. Certainly. Here is Chapter 8 of Sherlock Holmes, and The Poisoned Pen, continuing in Dr. Watson's voice as the mystery deepens and the stakes rise. We left the London estate under the escort of Lestrade and his men, the ever-loyal inspector muttering darkly about false names, forged documents, and the questionable legality of poisonous poetry. Holmes was unusually silent as we traveled. By cab through the clinging fog toward Soho, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the gloom-streaked window. It was never about the poem, he said at last, so quietly I barely caught the words. It was always about the manuscript Marchmont found. Lestrade grunted. And what sort of manuscript gets a man killed these days, eh? A recipe for invisible ink? Holmes said nothing. We arrived at a narrow side street near Dean Street. The printer's shop was squeezed between a tobacconist and a tailor, its signage nearly illegible in the grime and soot of London's daily breath. A nervous-looking man in ink-stained sleeves met us inside, wringing his hands as if attempting to erase some unspeakable error. I didn't know what I had, I swear, he babbled. Mr. Marchmont came in near midnight 2 weeks ago. Sighed. It was urgent. Left me with a sealed envelope. Told me not to open it unless something happened to him, or someone came asking. Holmes extended his hand, with some reluctance. The printer surrendered the packet. It was heavier than expected thick, roughly bound in twine, the cover plain and yellowing with age. Holmes cut the string with a small blade and opened the first. Page. The handwriting was unmistakable. Marchmont's restless, elegant, and increasingly erratic. Holmes began to read aloud. Journal of E. Marchmont. If these pages find the light, know this, I did not run. I was made to disappear. I uncovered something. A manuscript anonymous, unsigned, buried in the archives of Strake's own magazine offices. Never published, never meant to be read. It was not a poem. It was a confession. A series of letters, detailing crimes disguised as art. I believe one of them was a murder written in the voice of the killer, a man who claimed he had perfected the poisoned pen, a way to kill without violence. Through words, paper, and ink, Lestrade muttered an oath. Holmes turned another page. The writing became more feverish. I showed it to Vellum. I thought he'd help. Instead, he panicked, said it was Strake's game. But I'm not sure. The voice in the manuscript wasn't Strake's. It was colder, calculating. Vellum said only one man could have written it, Sebastian Grieve. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Grieve. I had never heard the name until then. He was behind it all. He used Strake as a front, Vellum as a pawn. He fed poems to young men, bought their loyalty with praise and publication, and buried those who became inconvenient. The manuscript proves it, but if you're reading this, I have failed to bring it to light. Holmes closed the journal. What do you make of it? Lestrade asked. Holmes was already flipping through the remaining pages, eyes flicking like a metronome. At last he paused. It's not just paranoia, he said. There are transcribed excerpts from the original manuscript phrases that match the tone and rhythm of the forged sonnet we found in the aesthete. Marchmont was right. Grieve repurposed the material. He used a confession as poetry. Lestrade paled and printed it under Marchmont's name. Holmes nodded. To silence him, to frame him as unstable. And to conceal the origin of the real text, he tapped a final page, then handed it to me dotted red. I have hidden the original manuscript. It is in the spine of the Shelley bust on my mantelpiece. If I vanish, look there. We exchanged glances. Back to Clipstone Street, Holmes said briskly. At once. The hansom rattled over wet stones, cutting through Soho toward Marylebone. I could feel Holmes's urgency, now the chill of racing against whatever terrible hand might already be moving to erase the last trace of truth. We reached Marchmont's flat within the hour. The constable stationed outside recognized Holmes and admitted us without protest. The rooms were just as we had left them, quiet, dusty, still cloaked in the strange hush of a place abandoned mid-sentence. Holmes crossed directly to the mantelpiece. The bust of Shelley still sat in its place, the chipped nose lending it a tragic air. With delicate fingers, Holmes tilted the figure. A hollow sound. He took out his penknife and gently pried at the base. The marble gave way with a faint click, and from within, wrapped in a tightly wound oilcloth, Holmes drew out a slender sheaf of parchment, yellowed, ink-stained, and brittle at the edges. He unwrapped it on the desk. Lestrade and I leaned in. The handwriting was unfamiliar, meticulous, angular, with a chilling detachment to its rhythm. The text was no poem. It was something colder. A diary entry, perhaps, a monologue, or a confession written by a man devoid of guilt. They believed it art. That was my brilliance. I composed it like verse. A stanza here, a murder there. Each line. An experiment. I used ink laced with poison. Paper soaked in madness. One boy bled from the gums. Another wept for nights before hanging himself. I signed none of them. Let the critics guess. Let the editors weep. Only one saw through me. But he's quiet now. Quiet as he'll ever be. Beneath this was a list of dates, names, none of them Marchmont's. But one, at the very end, chilled me to the bone. E. Marchmont. U for correction. Holmes exhaled, softly. The madman wrote this as art, he murmured. Not merely to confess, but to celebrate. This is the original manuscript Marchmont found, the source of all the forged poems, of Greaves' entire game. Lestrade straightened. And it'll hang him. Holmes shook his head. No, Grieve. Never put his name to it. The handwriting is distinct, but not traceable. We must draw him out, force a mistake. Let him see that the one thing he tried to kill, the truth, still lives. Lestrade looked uncertain. You have a plan? Holmes gave one of his rare, razor-thin smiles. I always do. To be continued in Chapter 9. The man who wrote in blood. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 9? You said colon. Yes, ChatGPT said. Certainly. Here is Chapter 9 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, continuing in Dr. Watson's voice as Holmes prepares to lay a careful trap for a literary killer. It is a curious feature of Holmes's character that he detested theater in all its forms, unless, of course, he was directing it. Then, and only then, would he embrace deception, disguise, and dramatic tension with the enthusiasm of a master. Dramatist thought thus, when he turned to me late that night and said, with something like gleeful precision, "We shall stage a resurrection, Watson." I knew he was not speaking metaphorically. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out his plan with the precision of a surgeon and the flair of a playwright. The journal would not be handed to Scotland Yard, not yet, nor would the original manuscript. Instead, we would allow a rumor to spread, one carefully whispered into the right ears. A whisper that Edmund Marchmont was alive and ready to publish the manuscript in full. Truth, Watson, Holmes murmured, is the one poison even liars cannot stomach. Grieve has murdered to silence it. Let us see how far he will go to. Kill it again. But Marchmont is still missing, I protested. Do you believe he's alive? Holmes gave no answer. Instead, he sent notes to 3 underground publishers under false names, suggesting that a new anonymous confession would be printed in a radical literary review by week's end. The bait was cast. All that remained was to watch who came to bite. Then he made a curious request. "Watson," he said, "you must write something for me. Something brief. 4 stanzas." In Marchmont's voice, I blinked. "You want me to forge a poem?" "Imitate, not forge," he said. "We are not deceiving history, only the deceivers. Make it haunting, fragmented, let it hint at survival. A ghost returning." That night, under gaslight, and guided by memory and dread, I wrote. From poison's quill, I did not die, though ink was dark and silence near. Beneath the floor, beneath the lie, my name still burns. My voice draws near. They thought me mad. They made me mute. But words are roots, they burrow deep. I've inked a truth they can't refute. And from that grave, I do not sleep. Holmes had it copied in Marchmont's hand by a skilled forger, then delivered it anonymously to the Penny Lantern, a small radical publication known for scandal and pamphleteering. A note was added, the first stanza of the lost manuscript. The poet returns. London, being London, did the rest dot by the following morning. The poem had appeared in at least 3 news columns, each speculating breathlessly that Marchmont lived, that he had survived an assassination attempt by some secret literary cabal, and that a full expose was imminent. Holmes read each article with detached amusement. "That should rattle the cage," he said. "Now we watch who comes to rattle back." And indeed, someone did. That very evening, a stranger appeared at Miss Violet Marchmont's lodgings at the Mitre. He gave no name, wore a dark coat, and smoked clove cigarettes. The concierge described him as polite but menacing. He left. No message, only a warning. He told her, the man said, that silence is safer than survival. Holmes's eyes narrowed when he heard this. It's Greaves' style. Indirect, elegant, he's frightened. But why not simply act? I asked, if he's killed before, why not again? Because he's no longer sure of the facts. Holmes replied, he doesn't know who has the manuscript, or whether Marchmont is truly dead. And a man like Grieve fears uncertainty more than scandal. Still, we could not rely on fear alone to draw him out. Holmes sent another message the next day, this time directly to the London aesthete, addressed to the editor in a florid script. Your sins are bound in verses still unread. The pen remembers. So do I. Shall we meet again beneath the sign of the Muse? E.M. It was theatrical, certainly, but so was our adversary. Holmes arranged for Lestrade to discreetly stake out the Sphinx Club in Bloomsbury, the location referenced in the poem. He predicted, correctly, that Grieve would not dare respond publicly, but he would try to meet whoever had sent the letter, hoping to bargain, bribe, or eliminate them in person. Tomorrow night, Holmes said, I shall be Marchmont. He dressed the part with disturbing ease, a tattered coat, dyed hair, a pallor conjured with powders and artful shading. When he turned to me with dark-rimmed eyes and a twitch of nervous energy in his manner, I was momentarily startled. My dear fellow, I said, you look ill. Excellent, he replied. So must a man look who has escaped death, but not its scent. We arrived at the Sphinx Club shortly after 10, Holmes entering first, while I watched from across the street with Lestrade and a constable in plain clothes. What happened next was so sudden, so carefully executed, that had I blinked, I might have missed it. A black carriage pulled up beside the club's side entrance. The driver remained hidden beneath his hat. Holmes Marchmont was beckoned by a gloved hand. He approached. The door opened, and a shot rang out, not from the carriage, but from a rooftop across the street. Holmes dropped instantly, vanishing into the shadows. Lestrade's whistle pierced the air, and within seconds, officers were swarming. The carriage bolted, but not far. One of the constables had spiked the tires. The driver was seized. Inside the carriage, Sebastian Grieve, pale and furious. But it was not he who had fired the shot. That man, found minutes later on a neighboring rooftop, dead by his own hand, carried nothing but a note. Forgive me. I only wrote what he told me. I never knew it was real. B. Strake Holmes emerged moments later, unscathed, brushing dust from his collar. Well, he said, it appears the ink has dried, and the pen, at last, is broken. To be continued in Chapter 10. Echoes in Empty Rooms. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 10? You said colon. Yes, ChatGPT said, certainly. Here is Chapter 10 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, continuing in Dr. Watson's voice as the conspiracy begins to unravel, but the mystery is not yet fully laid bare. The morning after the failed attempt on Holmes's life, London was curiously quiet. The fog had lifted, but the newspapers had not. While none yet dared name names, whispers of scandal flitted through literary salons and gentlemen's clubs with the same velocity as influenza. A poet returned from the grave, a literary agent arrested at the Sphinx, and secret writings found in a Shelley bust were all hinted at with lurid vagueness. But the full truth had not surfaced, and Holmes, it seemed, intended to keep it that way. For now, back at Baker Street, I found Holmes standing before the window, his silhouette framed against the gray light, a cigarette burning low in one hand. The remains of the forged sonnet, Marchmont's journal, and the original confession manuscript lay spread across the floor, like puzzle pieces awaiting their final placement. Lestrade had taken Sebastian Grieve into custody the night before, but without the physical evidence tying him to the poisonings, and with Strake dead by his own hand, the inspector's confidence was clearly shaken. The case to the Yard appeared thin, but Holmes saw more. Grieve won't hang for murder, Holmes said. Not yet. There's too much ink between his fingers, but not enough blood. He's clever enough to let others commit his sins. He bent, lifted a small paperweight from beside the journal, and tapped the manuscript's cover. But there is a question still unanswered. Why Marchmont? Why now? I was about to respond when there came a sharp knock at the door. Got Mrs. Hudson. Entered, carrying a telegram on a tray. Holmes took it, his eyes flicking across the short message. He froze. What is it? I asked. He handed me the telegram. From Violet Marchmont. Bloomsbury Mitre urgent. Received note. Says Edmund is alive. Met me tonight Blackfriars Bridge. 9 p.m. I looked up. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Surely. I began. This could be another trap. Undoubtedly, he said. Which is why we shall spring it ourselves. That evening was bitter cold, and Blackfriars Bridge was nearly deserted by the appointed hour. Gaslights shimmered on the black surface of the Thames, and the faint whistle of a riverboat echoed from downriver. Holmes, Lestrade, and I arrived separately, each stationed at one end of the bridge or hidden in shadow. Miss Marchmont arrived. Promptly at 9, alone, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak. Her eyes darting nervously between the iron lampposts dotted first. Nothing happened. Then, from the far end of the bridge, a figure emerged from the mist. He walked slowly, as if unsure of his footing, his form thin and stooped. As he stepped into the pool of light cast by the nearest lamp, I gasped. It was Edmund Varchmont. Paler, thinner, his clothes ill-fitting and soaked at the hem, but unmistakably him. Violet cried out and rushed to him, but Holmes stepped forward, intercepting her gently but firmly. Wait, he said. Let him speak. Marchmont looked at us all with wild, wary eyes. I don't have much time, he rasped. They're still looking for me. You weren't supposed to find the journal. Who did this to you, Marchmont? Holmes asked quietly. Grieve, he said, trembling. And not just him. Others. Strake wasn't the worst. He was afraid of what I read. The manuscript? I asked. Marchmont nodded. It's not a confession. Not exactly. It's a map. Instructions. A pattern of deaths across the literary world, names changed, details altered, but real people, real victims. It's been happening for years. They called it art. Grieve called it editing the soul. He drew from his coat a folded scrap of paper. Holmes took it. On it were 6 names. Beside each, a date and a cryptic line of verse. The final name, E. Marchmont, to be concluded. With silence. I've been hiding, he said, moving from boarding house to boarding house. Vellum tried to help me, but they got to him. Strake wanted to talk, but Grieve had too much on him. I thought if I disappeared, would end. Holmes's face was unreadable. You did well to survive, he said at last, and now we can end it properly. Just then, a sharp whistle from the far side of the bridge. Lestrade appeared, dragging a shadowy figure from the mist. A man in a long coat, his face hidden under a hat. When Holmes pulled it off, I recoiled. It was Jasper Redmore, the chemist. Found him watching from the embankment, Lestrade said. Had this on him. He held up a slender glass vial. Holmes took it, sniffed it, then nodded grimly. Curare, he said. Again. Redmore remained silent under questioning, but the truth was plain. He had been dispatched to ensure Marchmont. Never reappeared. Holmes turned to Violet, who clung now to her brother in disbelief. You must vanish again, he said. One final time. But this time under my protection. That night, Edmund Marchmont disappeared once more into a safe-house Holmes arranged in a village outside London. There, under an assumed name, he would remain until the case was closed fully and publicly. Back at Baker Street, Holmes placed the final piece of the puzzle atop the manuscript, Redmore's vial. One more night, he said, and then we lay it all before the press. Not a confession, not a scandal, a case study, a warning. He turned to me. Watson, you shall write it, but not as fiction, not as a tale of adventure, as evidence. There is no greater antidote to poisoned words than truth, cleanly told. I nodded. And for the first time in many weeks, Holmes allowed himself the smallest smile. To be continued in Chapter 11. The case in print. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 11? You said colon yes, ChatGPT said. Certainly. Here is Chapter 11 of Sherlock. Holmes and the poisoned pen, as the public confrontation draws near, and Holmes sharpens the final edges of his case. There are few things in this world that Sherlock Holmes regarded with true reverence. The violin of Paganini, the chemistry of alkaloids, and perhaps most surprisingly, the press. Not the scandal sheets or cheap sensation rags, but the sober-minded. Broadsheets and literate reviews that informed, if not always entertained. Holmes knew that for all the hidden poisons in London, the most effective antidote was often exposure. And now, with all pieces in place, he intended to wield the printed word with the same precision as a scalpel. Watson, he said the next morning, the time has come. The ink must flow. He slid a sheaf of neatly ordered papers across the table toward me. Atop them, my own notes from the case, scrawled over the past 10 days with increasing urgency. Beneath those, transcriptions of Marchmont's journal, selections from the original confession manuscript, and forensic summaries prepared in Holmes's crisp, economical hand. You will write the account, he said, but not under your name. The article must appear anonymous. Let the reader believe it was penned by an insider, someone who saw the blood on the pages, not just the pages themselves. I stared at him. You wish me to conceal that it was you who solved the case? Holmes lit his pipe and leaned back in his chair. Let Grieve wonder. Let those who profited from the poison doubt, who among them turned informer. We're not prosecuting in court. We're prosecuting through conscience. I did not argue. I had seen Holmes employ anonymity before, not out of modesty, but as a tool, a weapon, a mask behind which truth could move undetected doubt for 2 days. I worked at the manuscript writing, revising, shaping the narrative. Holmes, when consulted, made only the subtlest of adjustments. He was meticulous about tone, no embellishments, no romantic flourishes. The article, he said, must read like the grim dissection of a corpse, clinical, undeniable. On the 3rd morning, we sent it under a sealed envelope to the Fortnightly Review, the one publication respectable enough to print it, and fearless enough to face the consequences. It appeared in print 5 days later under the stark headline, "The Poisoned Pen, a literary crime in 10 stanzas." Its impact was immediate and devastating. London's literati reeled. The article named no names, but left breadcrumbs unmistakable to those who knew the scene. A cabal of editors and agents described in just enough detail to make denial difficult and defense nearly impossible. Grieve's name was never mentioned, but by sundown he had resigned from 3 societies and closed his firm's office on Middle Temple Lane. More damning still was the reprinting of the anonymous confession from Marchmont's discovery, published in facsimile, its murderous prose. Now widely known, ink is cleaner than blood and twice as permanent. I killed no one, only offered words and watched the consequences. Some thought it a hoax. Others called it a dark satire. But those who had known Vellum, Strake, and the lost poets of that circle felt otherwise. Miss Violet Marchmont, having been apprised of the article's release, wrote Holmes a short note that same afternoon. My brother read the piece aloud by the hearth. He wept at the ending. Then he slept without fear for the first time in months. You have my thanks, Mr. Holmes, and my silence, if ever needed again. Holmes read the letter without expression, then placed it into the fire. A week later, Lestrade came by Baker Street with news. Grieve's gone to ground, he reported. Left London the day after the article. No one's seen him since. No charges hold without a name. But between you and me, I think you've done worse to him than the courts ever could. Holmes only said, the man was a parasite. He fed on fear, and now it's his own he must digest. Still, Lestrade said, we've no hard proof of murder. Holmes shook his head. Strake's suicide was confession enough. Redmore's capture confirmed his role. And as for Grieve, his retreat is louder than any plea. Lestrade studied Holmes a moment and gave a reluctant nod. Very well. Just don't write me in as a fool in your next account, Watson. I gave a non-committal grunt. In truth, I had not written him in at all. That night, Holmes returned the confession manuscript to its envelope and placed it atop a stack of old case files in the tin dispatch box by the hearth. He locked it with a brass key and did not speak of it again. Do you think he'll resurface? I asked. Grieve? Holmes shrugged. Perhaps, but men like him are cowards at heart. He will live among new masks, in new cities, quietly. But he'll never write again. That I promise you. And Marchmont? Holmes glanced to the fire. He may yet find his voice again, once it no longer trembles. But poetry must be free of fear, Watson, or it becomes a lie. Then he added, almost to himself, words can wound, but they can also heal. Perhaps in time, his will. To be continued in Chapter 12. A letter from Florence. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 12? You said colon, yes, Chat GPT said? Certainly. Here is Chapter 12 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen in Dr. Watson's voice. As the mystery begins to echo beyond London and new threads emerge from abroad. It was nearly a fortnight after the publication of the fortnightly review article when the postman delivered a curious envelope to Baker Street. Unlike the usual clatter of correspondence medical pamphlets for me, chemical catalogs, and the occasional coded telegram for Holmes, this envelope bore the delicate calligraphy of another age. It was addressed to Holmes in a flowing Italian hand, sealed in red wax with a simple fleur-de-lis. Holmes, still in his dressing gown and deep. In the pages of a monograph on toxic dyes and Renaissance manuscripts, took the letter without expression. He broke the seal, unfolded the thick vellum parchment within, and read the contents silently. Then he folded it again, laid it on the table between us, and said, "Grieve has resurfaced." "Where?" "Florence." I took the letter, curious. It was signed by one Count Luca dalla Torre, a name unfamiliar to me. The letter was both gracious and wary in tone. Translated roughly, it read, "Mr. Holmes, your recent article, though published without attribution, reached me through a private translation. It has ... stirred matters here in Florence. A certain Englishman residing under the name Mr. Greaves has taken up residence in a villa near the Arno. He receives no visitors, writes nothing, and walks only at night. And yet poets near him fall strangely silent. One, a promising young pamphleteer, was found 3 days ago, having poisoned himself. There was no note, only a fragment of verse, unsigned and oddly phrased. The last word is not mine. He wrote it on my tongue. Mr. Holmes, I suspect your Englishman brought more than luggage to Italy. I write in confidence and in curiosity. I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe some men leave curses behind them when they flee. If you are inclined to travel, you would be welcome here. And if not, then accept this letter as a warning. Your man may be gone from London, but his shadow is not far." From others, "Alla dalla Torre." When I finished reading, I glanced up. Holmes was not looking at me, but staring out the window, where the sun was beginning to struggle through the smog. "You think it's him?" I asked. "I do. But if he has ceased publishing, what danger remains?" Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then, with a sudden energy, he rose and crossed to his desk. He withdrew from a drawer the fragment we had recovered from Marchmont's manuscript, the list of names, dates, and verses. He tapped one entry near the bottom. Florence. "Spring. L.M." Holmes murmured. "Likely not Marchmont, but someone else. Someone Grieve marked for correction, and he's begun again." I frowned. "But why Florence? Why not disappear entirely?" Holmes lit his pipe. "Because predators need prey, and because Florence is one of the last places where poetry still moves like currency among men. He's found a new circle, new minds to twist." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind rattling the window pane. Holmes continued, "He is no longer in control, Watson. The manuscript, his so-called confession, has escaped him. But that loss has only made him more dangerous. He'll attempt now not to silence critics, but to inspire fear again, to make the myth of the poisoned pen grow until it eclipses the truth. What will you do?" I asked. "I shall write to Count della Torre carefully. No commitment. Not yet." He looked over the rooftops of Marylebone, the gray spires giving way to the pale morning sky. "And then, perhaps, we travel." The idea of Holmes voluntarily leaving London was, I must confess, as strange to me as the notion of the Thames freezing in midsummer. He was so much a creature of its fog, its alleyways, its whispering back streets, that I could not imagine him beneath Tuscan sun or in marble halls. And yet there was something in his manner that suggested he knew the case was not complete, not morally nor logically. That Greaves' exile was not a resolution, but merely an intermission. That afternoon, I found Holmes making inquiries into certain Florentine periodicals, writing to a bookseller on the Via dei Calzaioli, and reviewing railway timetables with the same absorption he once gave to poisoners in Prague or counterfeiters in Rotterdam. Then he said, without looking up, "Watson, how is your Italian?" "Rusty," I admitted. "Then sharpen it." He turned one of the folded pages toward me. It was a reprinted poem from a small Florence review unsigned, and newly published. They said he fled across the sea, but ink has roots, and roots hold fast. His verses still arrive in dreams, and what he writes is always last. Holmes gave a dry smile. "I fear," he said, "the poisoned pen has not yet run dry." To be continued in Chapter 13. Villa of Whispering Leaves. Shall I continue with Chapter 13? You said, "Yes," ChatGPT said. "Certainly." Here is Chapter 13 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, continuing in Dr. Watson's voice as the mystery leads Holmes and me beyond England and into a darker silence. I had not seen Florence in many years, not since a brief posting during my service abroad, and never in the company of Sherlock Holmes. One might assume, as I did, that such a place sun-soaked, framed by cypress and arch, full of warm stone and echoing cathedrals, would have softened the man. But Holmes was no tourist. He arrived as a bloodhound arrives in a new field, alert, unsmiling, already sniffing for corruption beneath the lily dot. We traveled under assumed names. Holmes became Mr. Henry Vernet, a nod to his French grandmother. And I once again was Dr. John Hamish. It amused him. Me, less so. But we arrived without incident, and within hours of stepping off the train at Santa Maria Novella. Holmes had vanished down a cobbled alley with Count Della. Tor's letter in hand, God, it was dusk when we arrived at the villa. The Count had sent his own carriage lacquered, discreet, with a driver who spoke not a word. We passed through the outlying hills, beyond the Arno, into a shaded grove of ancient olive trees. The villa itself was half swallowed by its gardens. The ivy hung thick on its stone facade, and tall poplars crowded the drive, their leaves whispering. In the faint breeze, a servant led us through a tiled atrium to the study, where Count Della Torre awaited. He rose with grace, a man in his late 50s, dressed with an understated richness only old blood can carry. He bore himself like a swordsman who had laid down his blade, but not his instincts. "Mr. Holmes," he said in lightly accented English, "or shall I say Vernet? You are welcome." Holmes bowed slightly. "You were wise to write." The Count nodded. "And you were wise to come." "He is here. Of that I am certain." "Grieve?" I asked. "No. He calls himself Mr. Leadenhall now, an English recluse. He rents a villa up the hill, Villa Carmina, rarely seen. But since his arrival, poets die." He crossed to his desk and opened a drawer, withdrawing several sheets of paper flimsy, printed on cheap pulp. Holmes took them and scanned the top page. It was a clipping from a local literary pamphlet, La Voce Nuova, the 7th of May obituary. Giulio Santi, poet and pamphleteer, found dead in his studio in San Frediano. Self-inflicted poisoning suspected. Only clue, a torn manuscript, unsigned, titled The Silence Before Ink. Another clipping described a young translator, Lucien di Parini, whose body had been pulled from the Arno, 3 days prior, pockets filled with stones, but no water in the lungs. And finally, a note scrawled in blue ink, to those who imitate. Remember, the pen that kills is not always drawn in anger. Holmes looked up. Greaves' aphorisms, still preaching murder as metaphor. The Count's expression darkened. "Yes, but it is not only murder, it is performance. He creates tragedy and watches the city interpret it." Holmes paced slowly. "Has he published under his new name?" "No, nothing. Not since your article, but the effect is the same. He's become a myth." They call him Il Poeta Silenzioso, the silent poet. And in Florence, Mr. Holmes, myth is more dangerous than truth. There was a moment's silence, broken only by the rustle of wind through the olive leaves. Holmes turned to the Count. "I must see the villa." The Count hesitated. "It is guarded." "Discreetly. But the owner keeps to himself. His only contact is a servant, a woman. English, mute, they say. He dictates notes. She delivers them." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A woman? Describe her." "Tall, severe, blonde hair gone to gray, perhaps once a governess. She goes to the market at sunrise. Returns before anyone can speak to her." Holmes gave me a look I'd come to know well. The case had turned, and a key had clicked into place. "And we'll meet her," he said. "At dawn." We took a room in Florence. Proper Holmes always insisted on city lodgings over countryside estates, citing access to newspapers, telegraphs, and the occasional good espresso and rose before light. Just past 5, we walked down to the Mercato Vecchio, still only half awake. The first vendors were just setting up. Cold blue light gathered over the Duomo, and there, moving with mechanical grace, her long coat brushing the cobbles, was the woman. She was older than I. Expected, with pale eyes and a hard line to her mouth. She carried a woven basket, nearly empty. Holmes stepped into her path. "Good morning," he said gently. In Italian, she did not respond. He repeated the greeting in English, still nothing. But when he said, quietly, "Miss Althea Rowe," the basket slipped from her fingers. She turned and ran. Holmes was faster. In 3 strides. He caught her by the wrist, not harshly, but firmly. She struggled, breathless, then collapsed to the bench beside a vegetable cart. Her chest heaved. Her lips parted, but no sound came. "She is mute," I said. Holmes nodded, crouching before her. "Miss Rowe, I remember you. From the Black Friars. Inquiry, 1891. You were secretary to the editor, vanished. You disappeared the same month. No body, no trace." She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. He lowered his voice. "You're not the author, are you?" "You never were." "You were. The keeper, the archivist. He dictated, you preserved. Even when you knew what he was writing." Her lips trembled. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a single page, the first stanza of the confession, the map of verses. He held it up. Her hand rose, as if compelled, and pointed to one line. "Lim, Florence. Spring." Then, with it, the last strength she seemed to possess, she took Holmes's pen from his breast pocket and scratched one name beneath it. Althea Roche dropped the pen, closed her eyes, and whispered, for the first and only time. He said, "I would be the final poem." To be continued in Chapter 14. The silent poet, shall I continue with Chapter 14? You said colon, yes, ChatGPT said, certainly. Here is Chapter 14 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, as told by Dr. Watson. The final act begins to stir, and Holmes prepares for a confrontation not just with a killer, but with an idea that refuses to die. We returned from the marketplace in silence, the city of Florence still waking as the truth of what we had learned sank like weight into our bones. Althea Rowe's secretary, servant, scribe had not only enabled Sebastian Greaves' campaign of literary murder, she had been named within it. A final verse, a final victim, waiting to be penned. Holmes sat at the writing desk of our pension, his hands pressed flat to the blotting paper, his eyes locked on some middle distance I could not see. Outside, the rooftops glowed with Tuscan sun, but within, the shadows of London seemed to gather at his shoulders once more. She was to be the final act, he said at last, but not in the sense we thought. Not the last victim, the last voice. I frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes turned slowly to face me. Grieve is not merely a murderer, Watson. He is a myth-maker. He no longer needs to kill with his own hand. He merely places the idea then. Lets the world enact the tragedy. He held up the confession manuscript, our only surviving copy. This is not a record. It's a script, a pattern. He instructs others in the performance of despair. I felt the chill of understanding creep into my chest, and Miss Rowe? She was the closing metaphor, the silenced pen. He would erase the only witness to the origins of his work, and vanish forever into legend. But she's alive, I said. Holmes nodded, and terrified. But that is our chance. He pulled from the case his pocket watch and snapped it. Open. We have 3 hours. To do what? Holmes gave a small, grim smile. To write a better ending. The plan was simple in its ambition, and perilous in its execution. Very much Holmes's signature. With Althea Rowe's reluctant cooperation, Holmes crafted a letter in her hand carefully dictated, line by line, its tone precise, detached, and evocative. It read not as a cry for help, but a calm confession. The final page of a poisoned volume. You are right, always. My silence was the truest stanza. But I have written one last verse on my own terms. It will reach you by nightfall. There is no need to reply. I will not be here to read it. Holmes sealed it in an envelope addressed in her handwriting to Mr. Leadenhall, Villa Carmina. It was delivered by a messenger boy at 6:30. We waited. And as the shadows lengthened over Florence, Holmes took his final step. He dressed in plain brown tweed, not his usual disguise. No false beard, no theatrical flair. Instead, he chose invisibility, the kind that comes from appearing exactly as the world expects a forgettable man to look. Then he turned to me. You will wait with the Count. Keep Althea under guard. If I do not return by midnight. He did not finish the sentence. I rose, heart pounding. Holmes, let me come with you. He shook his head quietly. Some stories, Watson, must be told after they end, not during. Villa Carmina sat high on a hill, veiled in vines and twilight. Holmes ascended the stone path alone, his steps steady, the manuscript in his inner coat pocket, and a revolver in the lining, a precaution, never a preference. At the threshold, he did not knock. The door was open. Inside, the villa was silent. Not abandoned, but curated into silence. Heavy velvet curtains. Ink-stained quills in crystal vases. Stacks of parchment bound in twine. The air smelled of ink and dried herbs. On the far wall hung an oil portrait of a man young, pale, proud, whom Holmes recognized as Grieve in his Cambridge days. A shadow moved behind the curtain. Good evening. Sebastian, Holmes said, evenly. There was a pause. Then, so the pen arrives to sign the page. Grieve emerged. He looked older, paler, a little stooped. But his eyes retained the same glint of cold brilliance Holmes had described to me, the look of a man who saw people as words to be edited, not as souls to be understood. Holmes offered him the envelope. Her letter. Grieve took it slowly, opened it. As he read, Holmes watched him, carefully. A flicker in the brow, a twitch in the lip. By the final line, Grieve was trembling not with grief, but with hunger. She's done it, he whispered. She understood. No, Holmes said. She survived. The silence snapped like a rope. Grieve looked up. His hands tightened on the letter. I suppose you've come to arrest me. No. Then, kill me? Holmes's gaze did not falter. You've already done that to yourself. Grieve stepped backward, toward the fire. Holmes's voice rose just slightly. Don't. Let the ashes be metaphor, not alibi. But Grieve dropped the letter into the flames, watched it burn. You cannot kill the idea, he said. The idea is already out. Florence, London, soon Paris. They want tragedy dressed as truth. I merely gave them the pen. You gave them poison." Grieve smiled, and they drank it. Holmes stepped forward now. "Then let us change the taste." He drew from his coat the original manuscript, not the confession, but Marchmont's journal, the real voice. The survivor's record dot, and tossed it into Grieve's lap. "Your myth ends here. The world will read his truth." Grieve stared at the pages. For once, speechless. Holmes turned and walked away. He returned to our lodgings at 11-40. No blood on his hands. No need for it. Only ink, and an ending. Too. Be continued in Chapter 15. The final stanza. Shall I continue with Chapter 15? You said colon, yes, ChatGPT. Sighed, certainly. Here is Chapter 15 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, continuing in Dr. Watson's voice, as Holmes prepares to reveal the truth and to conclude a tale that has blurred the line between murder and metaphor. Ash and the faint scent of burnt parchment clinging to his cuffs. He said nothing for several minutes. I watched him from the writing desk, where I had been seated with a medical journal in hand, but not a single word absorbed. At last, he poured himself a small glass of brandy from the decanter Count de la Torre had left us, and took a seat near the fire. "Well?" I said. "He will not publish again," Holmes replied simply. "Is he dead?" "No," Holmes said, swirling the brandy. "But his myth is." He leaned back, his eyes half closed in the firelight. The idea of Grieve of Leadenhall, of the silent poet, was what he cherished most. He wanted the mystery to endure, not the man. But now, Watson, the mystery is solved. Not exposed in a courtroom, but unmasked. That is far worse for a man like him. I leaned forward. "You gave him Marchmont's journal?" "Of course, and I told him it would be published. Not in some underground pamphlet, but properly cleanly, with his name nowhere within it. No legacy, no scandal. Only a footnote. Obscurity." Holmes's lips curled faintly, not in triumph, but something far colder. He built his monument out of shadows. So I took away the light. The next day, Holmes and I visited Count de la Torre once more to thank him for his assistance. We found him in his olive grove, pruning branches in the sunlight, his eyes shaded by a broad straw hat. "So," the Count said as we approached, "he lives?" Holmes nodded, but no longer among the poets. The Count snipped a low branch and tossed it into a basket. "Sometimes, Senior Holmes, the cruelest punishment is to be forgotten." Before departing Florence, Holmes penned one final letter. It was addressed to the Fortnightly Review, unsigned, of course, and posted with care. It contained excerpts from Marchmont's journal, a sober account of the events that had unfolded abroad, and a short editorial titled "The Poisoned Pen," a retraction and a warning. There are men who believe that death lends beauty to words. There are editors who confuse genius with cruelty. But the poet who survives, the one who writes despite fear, is the only voice worth hearing. The issue would appear some weeks after our return to London. By then, Grieve had vanished once more, reportedly leaving Florence for Constantinople or Cairo someplace, farther even from language than law. We never saw him again. Back at Baker Street, things returned slowly to their usual rhythm. Clients resumed their nervous knocks. The Times piled up beside the hearth. Holmes once more grew lost in his experiments with Egyptian poisons, and I returned to my practice. But on certain evenings, when the fog was low and the lamps burned gold against the windows, Holmes would take out a small volume of poetry and read aloud softly, thoughtfully, not one of Marchmont's bitter early works, but his later verses, the ones he composed in hiding, the ones untouched by Grieve's influence. They were simpler, less adorned, but they were his own. One such night, Holmes read me a stanza that I shall never forget. It was the final poem in Marchmont's last collection. Ink and ash I do not want. A martyr's name, nor praise in halls, I never knew. I only want the page to turn and leave my silence up to you. Holmes closed the book and sat for a long while in silence. Then he said, not looking at me, do you know, Watson, in the end? I believe he won. Marchmont? Yes, he lived. He wrote. He walked away. He tapped the cover of the volume. That, he said, is the only true revenge on a man like Grieve. And so ended the case of the poisoned pen, not with a duel, not with a trial, but with a silence louder than any accusation. It is not the most dramatic of Holmes's adventures, nor the most perilous, but to my mind it may be the most profound. Because sometimes the sharpest blade is not steel, but the truth cleanly told. To be continued in Chapter 16. The woman who knew the ending. Shall the first continue with Chapter 16? You? Said Colon. Yes, ChatGPT said. Certainly. Here is Chapter 16 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen in Dr. Watson's voice. As a woman's buried role in the mystery rises again and a deeper reckoning comes to light. The first envelope arrived by hand. It bore no return address, no crest, and no signature. The seal was plain wax, cracked neatly at the edge, and the handwriting bold, upright, and unmistakably feminine, was unfamiliar to me. I discovered it on the breakfast table at Baker Street one unremarkable March morning. Holmes, who had left before sunrise to interview a pawnbroker in Camberwell regarding a completely unrelated case of forged opera tickets, had not yet returned. I turned the envelope over once, then again. Only 2 words were written across its face. Dr. John Watson inside was a single sheet, folded twice. The handwriting was steady, but clearly written under emotional strain. It read, You do not know me, but I know what you wrote. I have read your account of the man you call Grieve, and I know the story is not finished. There is more you did not say, and more that he did not write. I was the first to type his words. Before Althea Rowe, before Florence, before the poison became a myth. I want to speak with you. Alone. No police. No Holmes. Tuesday, 6 o'clock. Hampstead Heath, the north. Bench beyond the stone well. If you come, bring only your conscience. There was no signature. I read the letter twice more before Holmes returned. He tossed his hat on the hook with his usual disregard for aim, missed it, and let the bowler roll beneath the settee. No leads in Camberwell? He muttered. The forgeries are crude, done by amateurs with just enough art to deceive the desperate. It's hardly worth the ink. I waited until he had poured his tea before I slid the letter across the table. He read it once and said, Ah, that's all you have to say? I asked. Holmes looked at me, the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. It seems, Watson, that your narrative has disturbed more ghosts than mine ever could. You think it's genuine? He leaned back. The paper is inexpensive, but foreign. Italian, I believe common stock. The ink is English, and the reference to Althea Rowe implies knowledge of the inner circle, but not participation in its final acts. Yes, I believe it is genuine. Then we should both go. Holmes shook his head. She asked for you alone. That could be dangerous. That could be necessary, Holmes countered. Sometimes, Watson, people say things in your presence that they would never utter to me. He lit a cigarette, his mind already pivoting to another subject. But I could tell by the narrowing of his eyes that he'd not truly dismissed the letter at aught. Tuesday evening was cold and still, the sort of spring chill that lingers stubbornly beneath the illusion of blossom and light. I arrived at Hampstead Heath 5 minutes early and walked briskly to the bench described in the letter. It was set beyond a half-buried stone well, weather-worn and forgotten, where the trees pressed close. She was already there. She stood, When she saw me, a tall woman, plainly dressed in a navy cloak, her hat pulled low over auburn hair streaked with gray. Her face was pale but composed. She might have been a schoolmistress or a governess fallen into disuse. But her eyes told another story, bright, unflinching, and rimmed with the edge of secrets too long kept. "Dr. Watson," she said, "you have me at a disadvantage, madam." She hesitated, then offered a name. "My name is Amelia Ferrars." It meant nothing to me, until she added, "I was Greaves' first editor." We sat. Her voice was low but clear, the kind one instinctively leans toward. And what she told me, beneath the bare branches of the trees, was both horrifying and illuminating. "I met Sebastian in 1885, she said. "He was not yet dangerous, arrogant, certainly, unyielding, but still unsure of himself. He sent me. His first verses ghastly, pretentious things. I told him so. He admired that. He said I was the first person who ever edited him with intent rather than flattery." She paused, looked down, and then he began to write differently, darker, cleaner, as if something had changed. He showed me one poem, a short one, plainly written, about a man who throws himself into the Thames after receiving a rejection slip. I thought it was satire. But then I read the reports in the paper about a playwright, Arthur Levens, who had done exactly that. I drew in a breath. He sent the poem to Levens's former agent. A private copy. Anonymous. A tribute to your cruelty, it said. She nodded. That's when I knew. But I said nothing. Not to the papers. Not to anyone. He was careful, always indirect, always protected. She reached into her bag and withdrew a worn notebook. Its corners were curled, and its pages had been thumbed countless times. "This," she said, "is the original manuscript of The Doctrine of Ink, his first private volume. The one he never published, only gifted." She handed it to me. I opened. The first page, in the margin, a penciled note. "Art is the redirection of consequence." I closed it. "You knew," I said. "You knew and stayed silent." "Yes," she said, "and I'm not asking for forgiveness, only for the record to be full." I studied her for a long moment. "You could have spoken earlier." "I was afraid," she said, "not for myself, for what he would become if denied. And I was right." She stood. "Give the book to Holmes," she said. "He'll know what to do." "Will I see you again?" She hesitated. "I doubt it. I've already left Florence once. This time, I think I shall leave London." And with that, she walked away slowly, purposefully, vanishing into the trees like a last line of a poem written in wind. That night, Holmes turned the pages of the notebook slowly. He said nothing for a full half-hour. At last, he looked up. "There's no crime in it," he said, tapping the cover. "But there's an illness, a sickness dressed as insight. It begins as critique and ends in control." He placed the book beside the Marchmont Journal. "Now we have the prologue," he said softly. "And the epilogue?" I asked. Holmes met my eye. "That," he said, "you're still writing. To be continued in Chapter 17. Ink and Memory. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 17? You said colon. Yes, ChatGPT said, certainly. Here is Chapter 17 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, told once again in the voice of Dr. Watson. The arc of the mystery nears its conclusion, but the true cost of truth inked and endured comes into view. In the weeks following my encounter with Amelia Ferrars on Hampstead Heath, the fog of the Grieve affair began, at last, to lift. Holmes had fallen into one of his peculiar periods of intense quietude, the sort of brooding introspection that follows only the most morally ambiguous victories. It was not, I think, that he questioned the outcome. Rather, He questioned the world that had allowed such a mind as Greaves to operate unchecked for so long without law, without reason, without even notice. And perhaps he questioned the need for men like himself to confront such minds alone. Justice, he said to me one evening, is often found not in courtrooms, but in memory. And memory, Watson, is the most unreliable witness of all. We were seated in our sitting room at Baker Street. The fire had dwindled to coals, and the last rays of sunlight had died behind the veil of London's thick clouds. On the table before U.S. lay the 2 volumes that had come to define this peculiar case, the Marchmont Journal and Greaves' secret treatise, The Doctrine of Ink. I had taken to reading both, comparing the voices, the shifting tone, the contrasting philosophies. Marchmont's was human, erratic, emotional, yet vivid with conscience. Greaves' was cold, precise, controlling, and terrifying in its rhetorical elegance. He wrote as if he were a surgeon dissecting empathy itself. Holmes watched me read. Without comment, after some time, he said, "Do you know what I find most curious, Watson?" "No," I said, setting the book down. "What's that?" He pointed toward Greaves' manuscript. "There's no mention of why." "Why he began." "The killings?" I asked. "Why he chose to become an architect of silence. He records each event with brutal detail, even manipulates the timing like a novelist, first act, second act, crescendo, but never once does he explain what he believes justifies it. Perhaps he thought the actions spoke for themselves." Holmes steepled his fingers. Or perhaps he feared that once he gave the motive words, it would be torn apart by reason. He fell silent again, his eyes unfocused. A letter arrived that week from Count de la Torre in Florence. It contained 2 things. First, a short note of gratitude. Florence, he wrote, had begun to breathe again. No more suicides, no anonymous aphorisms passed beneath doors, no brooding Englishmen stalking poetry circles by moonlight. The city had been returned to its rightful caretakers, the living. The second item was more curious. A clipping from a small journal out of Constantinople. A review of a recent literary salon held at a local expatriate club. It praised a mysterious new English poet, one who published nothing, read only aloud, and refused to give his name. The review described the man's work as dangerous, intoxicating, and concerned chiefly with the idea of self-erasure as art. The poet's nickname among the locals? Il Susurro, the whisper. Holmes read it, folded it, and tossed it into the fire. "He survives," I said. "He fades," Holmes corrected. "It is not the same." "Will you pursue him?" "No. Let him haunt foreign parlors, whisper nonsense to second-rate salons. He's no longer dangerous, only pitiful. His myth died the moment Marchmont's truth entered the world." That night, I began writing my final notes on the case, though I knew, instinctively, that I would never publish them. Not every story, Holmes once told me, is meant for the Strand. Some truths are best recorded not for public record, but for posterity, for memory. And so I wrote, not to scandalize, not to entertain, but to understand. To understand how a man could kill with paper, how words, carefully arranged, could serve as both knife and cure, how silence, in the wrong hands, becomes a weapon. And how, in the end, the most dangerous idea in the world may be the belief that suffering can be made beautiful. On the final page of my notes, I copied something Holmes had murmured to himself that morning, not realizing I'd heard him. It was not in Latin, nor Greek, nor any chemical formula. It was a line of poetry. Not Greaves, not ne rchmont single quotes s. His own. The ink dries fast, but not the stain. And yet the hand still writes again. To be continued in Chapter 18. The last case. Of Sebastian Greaves shall I continue with Chapter 18? You said colon. Yes, Chat GPT said, certainly. Here is Chapter 18 of Sherlock Holmes and the Poisoned Pen, the final chapter of this case, told in the voice of Dr. Watson. The end draws near not. With thunder, but with something far more lasting, the shadow of a name that nearly rewrote truth itself. It is a strange thing to outlive a ghost. For months after the case had ended, after Holmes had closed the notebook, after Marchmont's journal had found a quiet place on our bookshelf, I would catch myself expecting another letter. Another whisper, another death inked in metaphor. The poisoned pen, like any legend, refused to vanish all at once. Even Holmes admitted, privately, that ideas so carefully constructed did not die neatly, they decayed and slowly. And yet, in time, the world did move on. Sebastian Grieve became, once more, what he had feared most, an obscure name whispered. Only in certain corners of literary circles, stripped of his mystique, his venom dulled by disuse. Holmes had beaten him not by exposure, but by subtraction, removing the very fuel his myth required. But then, one day in late September, another letter arrived. Unlike the others, it bore a return address. Beyoğlu, Istanbul. Holmes received it without remark and opened it in the window seat, letting the autumn light spill over his fingers. I watched from across the room, my breakfast half-eaten. After a long pause, he passed it to me. Mr. Holmes, it is over. Not in the poetic sense you so despise, but in the final, bodily sense, the kind the doctors confirm with pulses and silence. Sebastian Grieve is dead. He fell from the roof of the consulate library 2 nights past. No note, no last words. But the papers have already begun their work calling it accidental, poetic, ironic. They miss the point, as always. He died not because of your efforts, or mine. He died because the audience stopped clapping. There will be no grave. He requested ashes, scattered into the Bosphorus. You may now put down your pen. I turned the letter over. No address. No signature, save the initials. Amelia Ferrers, one of the few who had known the truth from the beginning, and one of the fewer still who had survived it. Holmes folded the paper with care and placed it in the back of the Marchmont journal. That, he said quietly, is how an author truly dies, not when the heart stops, but when the story no longer requires him. We did not speak of Grieve again for some time. Cases resumed: theft, blackmail, attempted murder, even one involving a stolen Egyptian scarab that Holmes declared refreshingly direct. But there were evenings, as the fog thickened in Baker Street, and the lamps cast long shadows on the walls, when I would catch him watching the fire, his violin silent in his lap, his eyes not here but far away on a villa in Florence, or a vide bench in Hampstead, or a half-burned manuscript in a madman's study. "Watson," he said to me one such night, "do you remember what you wrote? About ink and memory?" "I do," he nodded slightly. "It was well said. Ink stains, but memory that fades too." I frowned. "Then what remains?" Holmes leaned forward, taking a small book from the shelf. He opened to a blank page, and with quiet precision wrote a single line in his own sharp hand: Sebastian Grieve, B. 1856, D. 1895, officially. Again in 1900, properly. Then he closed the book, and that, he said, will be enough. In time, the case came to feel distant. Holmes never revisited the confession manuscript. He left it in my keeping, along with Marchmont's recovered works. I donated both anonymously to a private archive, with instructions they be sealed for. 50 years. I kept only one thing for myself: a copy of the letter Grieve had written to his first victim. It bore no threats, no cruelty, just a poem. But in those few lines, I saw the full scale of the man's coldness, his belief that words were weapons best wielded against the soul. I keep that letter not to remember him, but to remember what he cost, and what Holmes, through logic, restraint, and quiet force, prevented him from taking postscript many years later, long after Holmes had retired to Sussex, and I had all but closed my own medical practice. I returned to the Marchmont volume. I found, tucked into its final page, a slip of paper in Holmes's hand, dotted read, "Watson, one day you will be asked how this ended. You may even be tempted to dramatize it, his fall, his fire, his final words. Don't. Tell them the truth, that we won, not by catching him, but by denying him his story. That is the last and greatest deduction. Jeanne so ends the case of the poisoned pen, not in blood, but in ink, a weapon turned back upon its wielder. Myth unraveled, a silence restored, and the memory, at last, left to fade.